Hi, I'm Morgan Freeman. Paul Robeson, the great singer and activist, used to sing a song called Scandalize My Name. Ironically, because of the Red Scare during the Cold War, that song came to define his life because his name, along with that of many other performers, was scandalized by what came to be known as McCarthyism. Now, black performers were particularly vulnerable because we had just begun to be taken seriously. And any outspokenness against racism was seen as the work of communist agitators. Many of the performers you'll see in this film you may not recognize. It goes to show how blacklisting could make people disappear. A group of former FBI agents, with Hoover's support, put together this book, Red Channels, which claims to be a list of all the members of the broadcast entertainment industry who had communist affiliations. Red Channels became so successful that other groups formed their own list, so the black list grew. And the only way you could tell you were on this list is if you didn't get any work and people shunned you. And perhaps worst of all was the slander of your name and of the causes you believed in. Reading this book today is like an honor roll of entertainers, of people in the industry who had the courage and enough care to lend their name and talents to help others. Now, when the film begins, of course, we're in a happier time. Late 30s and early 40s, when people were trucking up to Harlem looking for a bright future. If you were an actor, you might try to get into Dick Campbell's Rose McClendon Players or Frederick O'Neill's American Negro Theater, though 10 years later, both O'Neill and Campbell were blacklisted for demanding better representation for blacks on television. But when our story begins, Harlem was the place to be.
I can remember the time when from 110th Street to 155th Street on 7th Avenue, it was called Harlem's Broadway. And white people on Sunday morning would come up there and drive very slowly because that was the day when all of the colored people, all of us, were dressed to the nines. I mean to the nines, with the gloves, with the veil, with the earrings, with your best Sunday dress. And people who lived on that avenue would look out and say, here they come a-strutting.
There's something of an institution in Harlem in the days when I came along about 1928. It's called the Tree of Hope. There was actually a tree on the corner of 131st Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem.
Those were the days when you walked by the Lafayette, where all the beautiful, wonderful, talented artists would be standing between shows underneath a Tree of Hope.
And it was once said that they could cast any black show they wanted to cast by coming up to 131st Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem, and they'd find all the black actors that they wanted right there under the Tree of Hope. So that's where we stood, under the Tree of Hope, hoping that some white producer would come uptown and would hire some of us to go downtown.
If you were out of work, all you did was walk across the street, right in the middle of the street, put your hand and make your wish. And sure enough, you'd get a job for the next week or something.
In 1936, I came to New York. And there my first work was with Dick Campbell in his particular group there, the Rose McClendon Players.
On the 23rd of April in 1939, I arrived in New York. On that Monday, I went and found the Rose McClendon Players. Dick Campbell was on stage nailing something, and I asked if I could join.
I was nailing scenery, and standing up, my back was to him. He came in and he said, "Mr. Campbell?" I said, "Yes." He says, "May I join your theater group?" I said, "Well, with a voice like that, I would say yes." And I turned around and looked to see who it was. And here was this long, tall, skinny-looking fellow. He looked very hungry. I said, "Well, you want to be in the theater?" He said, yes, sir.
When I came out of the Navy, I became a building superintendent, assistant to a building superintendent. And while doing the repairs in an apartment for one of the tenants, I had been given 2 tickets as a gratuity to attend a performance at a place called the American Negro Theater.
I learned about the American Negro Theater from a elevator operator in the building that I was living in. And he said, why don't you go over there and try to find out if there isn't something you could do? Because in those shows, you don't have to sing and dance like you in these other shows, or you don't have to act dumb and stupid carrying a tray and whatnot.
I didn't care what I had to do. I just wanted to be in the environment. I found it very stimulating. I found that there was an intellect, that there was a scholarship, there was purpose, and I was looking for purpose, and I thought this would be a very good place in which to start.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All through the night, I'm gonna let it shine. All through the night, I'm gonna let it shine. All through the night. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
I came out of the service with great expectations that we had just defeated fascism, we had just defeated totalitarianism, we had just defeated philosophy of white supremacy. The world was in a mood of great rejoicing.
One of the things that impressed me most about the New York theatrical scene when I came back from the war was an awareness on everybody's part that the war had been a serious challenge on the subject of race. We were all still shocked at what had happened in Europe to the millions of Jews and others in those camps.
I had expected that America would be open and generous and rewarding to its black citizens who had served in that war and had served with great honor.
And there seemed to be a determination immediately after the war to say to ourselves that that would never happen again. That on the subject of race, we were one, we were equal, and we were partners and brothers.
When we came back, there were many forces in America, very powerful, that decided that those of us who had been brainwashed with these new ideas from the war, that thought we could come back and change the way America was doing business, was in for a very cruel and a huge surprise. We were going to go back to conditions as was before. We were to be a bunch of niggers who were to come back and get those thoughts of freedom out of our heads.
We were seriously concerned that America be a different place as far as race was concerned. And that gave us a common objective that was bigger even than the parts we were playing. Broadway had a kind of social as well as a cultural function, which we took quite seriously. At the end of a performance every night, somebody would say, hey, let's go over to so-and-so's. They're raising funds to defend Willie McGee. Or somebody had been lynched in the South, or some atrocity had happened.
We made it our business to become part of any force that was speaking out against this inhumane cruelty.
And we were determined to force the issue of justice for everybody onto the public consciousness. And the total theatrical community, in my mind, seemed to be caught up in that. The producers were involved, the directors, the actors, the writers. We belonged to a sort of blessed confraternity, and we were glad to be comrades and marching forward in the same struggle. We didn't know how thoroughly we were being watched, certainly not in 46, 47, 48.
All of a sudden there emerged this noise. There erupted this group that started to talk about any and all of us who dared to embark on such conduct were unpatriotic and were working towards the worst interests of our home. Our patriotism was to be seriously challenged. And some of us listened to these utterances with complete disbelief. As a matter of fact, it was a huge stretch of the imagination to suggest that those of us who had struggled against racism and oppression and sexism and all the things we struggled against were unpatriotic. When in fact, we knew and felt righteously strong.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man I don't like to be. What does he care if the world's got troubles? What does he care if the land ain't free? Old Man River, that old Man River, he must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along.
My experience with Paul Robeson was on more levels than one. On the personal level, he was an immediate mentor and a hero for those of us in the theater who wanted to be actors. We wanted to be, to some degree, like he was. He was huge, he was beautiful, he could sing, and he was an athlete, and he was sexy. He had all of the positive things that a young man and a young woman could be inspired by. Paul represented to us that top moment, the top possibility. An artist in every sense of the word, but his art was not only an expression of his own talent or his love for beauty, it was his expression of concern for the rest of us. The artist was the nurturer, the artist was the defender, the artist was the spokesperson.
He helped me interpret song. He inspired me. He gave me platform in which to learn, to understand much about human conduct and human affairs. His sensitivity, his honor, his honesty, his compassion, all played a huge role in how I perceived art and artists to be, and how powerful we were and what we could achieve.
He was one of the greatest figures in American culture. A singer, a giant of a man, an all-American football player, Phi Beta Kappa, law student, actor, Shakespearean, and a leader of his people.
And so inspiring was he and so powerful was he that at all costs, he had to be silenced. And as a matter of fact, on the agenda to silence him was the understanding that if we can silence him, all others will come far more easily.
Paul was a threat because he was a tremendously intelligent and well-learned man. Paul also had charisma in the same sense that Martin Luther King had charisma. In other words, Paul was the kind of man that could lead masses of people. And those who understand those things knew that Paul Robeson was the man who could affect large majorities. Now, all this took place in an atmosphere superheated by the relationships between Russia and America at the time.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States.
The reason that Robeson was a very strong supporter of the Soviet Union was his belief that they had no discrimination policies against blacks there or against anybody else. Well, he was treated like a prince whenever he came there. He didn't really know what was going on in the rest of the country. So his identification with the Soviet Union, whether he was an actual communist or not, was unimportant. He was theirs, and he supported them in policies both political and cultural, and made a big speech at one point that no black man and no black person in America would ever go to war against the Soviet Union, which sounded like he was calling for treason among the black population in the United States.
The statement he made about blacks not fighting against their own interest was interpreted by a lot to mean that he was saying to us, you blacks can't fight. You shouldn't fight the Russians no matter what. Then the powers that be, meaning J. Edgar Hoover, had to cut down Paul's influence. And they set out to demolish the man, and they took some heavy bites out of him.
Baseball's top hitter and star second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, comes to bat for Uncle Sam to refute Paul Robeson's remark that U.S. Negroes would not fight in a war against Russia.
I'm on my way to Washington to testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. That's all I can say at this time. I'll make further statements from Washington.
Robinson is the last witness to testify concerning the loyalty of the members of his race. And before the committee, he reads his own prepared statement.
I've been asked to express my views on Paul Robeson's statement in Paris to the effect that American Negroes would refuse to fight in any war against Russia because we love Russia so much. I haven't any comment to make except that on that statement, except that if Mr. Robeson actually made it, it sounds very silly to me. And most Negroes and Italians and Irish and Jews and Swedes and Slavs and other Americans would act just as all these groups did in the last war. They'd do their best to keep their country out of war. If unsuccessful, they'd do their best to help their country win the war against Russia or any other enemy that threatened us.
Jackie came into the big leagues in 1947, and we appreciated, we loved, and we honored and were honored by him and his behavior both on the baseball field and off. We recognized the tremendous pressure that was on him. We recognized that he was required not to hit back. We recognized that he had been, to some degree, willing to give up his own life so that baseball and the people who controlled it could make a statement that would open up the doors. So I assumed the pressure was put on Jackie, and there he was in that symbolic position. And I remember years later, Jackie himself still carrying the scar and pain of having to do that. And it broke his heart and broke our hearts too.
So the blacks here said, hey, wait a minute. You know, the organization people, we don't want to get too close to Paul. I mean, we love him like a brother, but he's can be poison to us. We have more important things to do. We're trying to fight to get our rights to go into restaurants, to go into housing, to get jobs on an equal basis. And Paul Robeson is just muddying the waters with the talk about the Soviet Union. And so he was alienated and isolated from all sides.
If you're looking to create disunity, if you're looking to destroy something that is strong and good and real and needed, you must go after the most powerful voice that articulates that agenda. No voice was greater than Paul Robeson's in talking about democracy and the rights of human beings.
There is one of the greatest cultural figures in American history, and he was banned, in effect, from making a living. Nobody wanted to touch him. Couldn't get a passport to go to Europe. His concerts here were kind of damaged.
I met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name. You call that brother? No, no. You call that brother? No, no. Call that brother? No, no. Scandalize my name.
In American politics, there's always been a large use of labels or scare words, behind which were issues which were not brought out into the open. Now, during the First World War, it was anarchists. By the time of the Second World War, anarchists were no longer seemed very interesting, but it was more interesting to call people communists because of the rise of the Soviet Union.
If you remember, for the longest time, the majority of power in Congress, the decisive power was wielded by not the Dixiecrats, but the Southern component.
Their power rested entirely on the fact that they represented districts where blacks could not vote, in which blacks were in a majority. So if the blacks won the vote, their power would end immediately.
And they were the ones who were most ardent in their pursuit of the Red Devils, and they were the ones who were most ardent in keeping the blacks down.
We know that to J. Edgar Hoover, an interest in improving the status of the Negro was a communist symptom, just as the idea of being interested in better relations with the Soviet Union was a communist symptom.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
Before McCarthy came along, the industry, both Hollywood and broadcasting, had already established what McCarthy was accused of doing, sort of terrorizing the people who worked in it.
I can remember very well when I first saw Red Channels, because it was my 42nd birthday. I happened to wander into a bookstore, and there was this thing, Red Channels, with a microphone and a red hand over it. And I picked it up to look at it. It was $1. And I suddenly saw what it purported to be, a documentation of a conspiracy to take over the broadcast media for the Soviet cause. That's what it said it was. And this was a list of 151 people that showed how who these conspirators were.
The point of this book was everything you wanted to know about every writer or performer, and most of these people were well-known performers who had appeared at functions during the war, had been supported by the War departments, and Mrs. Roosevelt, who herself was suspect.
What they were being condemned for was all the things that had been liberal impulses over the last 20 years. More rights for the Negro, civil liberties, better relations with the Soviet Union, peace. Red Channels was the beginning of it. But this was such a nice business that other agencies grew up and did the same sort of thing. was an organization called AWARE, which very aggressively began to list other people who were not in red channels.
There was a publication called Counterattack. There was one called AWARE. And then there was the Attorney General of the United States of America, who had his own list. The State Department had a list. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had a list. The Ku Klux Klan had a list. All the white citizens groups had a list. Some unions had a list.
You had these clearance bodies set up by some group that decided, since they had the expertise, they could read newspapers and clip the Daily Worker and find out who appeared at a certain kind of a function as a singer, as a writer, as a performer. Before you knew it, some of the best people in the business were being blacklisted.
Throughout the 1940s, something which could be used against my mother and many others was the assertion that the causes that they embraced were also causes that the Communist Party embraced. When my mother was confronted with this, she said, "I'm not going to relax my efforts to get equal rights for people of color merely because the Communist Party also embraces that effort." And she rejected as totally false any attempt to claim that she was a communist or communist sympathizer because of her work for civil rights. One of the criticisms of her was that she had entertained Soviet troops. I said, there you are, entertaining troops of our enemy. I remember a reporter asking her about this. Miss Scott, how could you have entertained these troops of our enemies? And she said, well, look at the date. It was 1943, and if you recall, we were their allies then. She did a great deal of entertaining of troops, and quite often you had joint forces then toward the end of the war. So she thought it was no small irony that she was accused of being unpatriotic for something which 5 years earlier had been the height of patriotism. And at the same time, she was married to a very controversial member of Congress who himself was the object of attacks by some of his colleagues and others. She was convinced that his enemies also had used her as a way to reach him, and that she was particularly vulnerable because of the fact that her livelihood depended on acceptance not only by the public, who were buying the tickets and turning on her radio show and television show, but also by the networks and the advertisers.
An atmosphere of mystery hung over the whole business of red channels. The copies disappeared into the desks of executives, and they began to use them to decide whether or not to hire an actor.
One of the themes of my mother's appearance before the Un-American Activities Committee was her repeated denials of the truth of what had been published. She said this is not true, and it was improper for a publisher to, in effect, try to end someone's career by publishing inaccurate information. My mother kept pointing out that at no time had anyone made a single telephone call to her, sent a telegram to her, sent a letter to her, asking, is any of this true?
The agency tried very hard not to put anything in writing about this whole system. And they even corrupted the language to take care of it. They didn't say he's not acceptable, they said he's not available.
In fact, her appearance before the committee was at her request. She hadn't been subpoenaed. Many people advised her not to do it. She said, this is a matter where not only my career, but my name have been taken and used improperly. Here you had someone who had had her own network radio program. From the early 40s on, you had someone who was, I believe, the first black headliner of a weekly network television program, who appeared in movies regularly, and all of that stopped. And it all stopped just after the time of her appearance before the committee.
It's important to remember that this whole dreadful period happened at the very birth of television. That is, television in its first years lived in this atmosphere of backbiting and defamation and fear, which I'm sure had an enormous effect on its future.
When I first discovered the blacklist was I had gone to see my agent, and it was about getting a job in television. And he was an agent in one of the most powerful agencies in America, and I was just at the threshold of the launching of my own career. And he pulled out a drawer in his desk, reached for a phone that was not part of the regular phone bank. He dialed a number, and all he did was to give my name, Harry Belafonte. And then he waited for instruction, and then he hung up the phone, closed the drawer, and said, "You're on the list. You're unemployable."
We figured, you know, we would go crazy if we tried to figure out whether we were blacklisted because we were black or blacklisted because we were red.
Evening old scores is what this was all about.
Tradition was that whoever won the Tony Awards in the theater was on the following Sunday after the awards were given to appear on the most popular television show in America, The Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan was rooted in American journalism. He was a most powerful reporter. And he and Walter Winchell and Dorothy Kilgallen and a host of journalists used their tabloids to become supporters of the blacklist. And when my name came up as the winner of the Tony Award, he was told that I was unacceptable. And he then called me to come and have an interview with him, and I went. And he said, "You know, there is some resistance to your coming on the show because of," and he read a list of things that I had been accused of. And I said to him that many of the things on the list were true, and other things on the list were false. But I do not choose to identify which is true and which is false, because that is not really the issue. The issue is my right to privacy, my right to my beliefs as an American citizen, and that I was sorry that I did not have the opportunity to appear on his show. I would dearly have loved to do so. It would have meant a lot to my career, and I thanked him and I left. That evening, I got a call from the very same agent who had picked up the phone in the other instance to tell me that I was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that I should be prepared to go to rehearsals that Saturday and that Sunday, and I'd be on the air live that same weekend. This fact and this act forever took me off the blacklist. Just Ed Sullivan's endorsement alone gave me that relief. But what it did do was that it instantly raised significant suspicion among my colleagues that I had betrayed them, because there was no way for me to have gotten on the Ed Sullivan Show if I had not played the betrayal game. And it was a very, very, very difficult time for me.
Down I went to CBS. I'll never forget it. And I stood in the doorway where the typewriters were and the producer was, and he said, "Yes, what are you doing?" He got up, and he was in his shirt. He said, "What are you doing here? We don't have any maids' roles." And I said, "Oh, I know, but I thought maybe I'd be allowed to read for the receptionist." And he drew himself up with pure disgust, looked at me and said, "When the day comes that we cast you people in a receptionist role, I will turn over in my grave."
The absence of black faces on television on a whole schedule is racism much more than any particular racist remark might be. So the most serious kind of racism is invisible.
I must tell you, I was blacklisted. I was a little bit tired of seeing black actors in radio as well as television that had just come on the scene, doing the kind of roles that they were doing at all times.
Now, Dick was one of those people, and still is, who always is aware of what is going on and what ain't going on, and always takes not only a position, but something in the back of his mind always pushes Dick to do something about it.
So I set up a campaign in the Negro press. I wrote articles, and I put out release after release, complaining and protesting against the type of roles that black actors were portraying in television and on radio and everywhere else.
And Dick, as a part of being Dick Campbell, on one occasion, since there were no blacks in television, called on Harlem to turn off the television set on Saturday night.
I said, don't turn on your TV. Leave it black, because that's the only way you can make the producers understand that you want a different type of show on television. So don't turn it on. They said, why not turn it on? Because if you don't turn on your television, the commercial producers will know that the products are not being sold to the audience, because 10% of the population of the United States that owns television set are not watching, so they will be losing money. That's what it's all about. So a boycott on this particular night, and we set up the boycott, and it worked. So then that's when they called me downtown.
I was surprised that the powers that be were so disturbed, but when they heard Dick calling for everybody to know, said, oh no, we must do something. And on the basis of that, Dick was sent for. And he talked, and he negotiated, and he opened some doors and got us some jobs. Of course, they never gave Dick a job.
But here's what you have to remember. Every role I played, I was a maid, I was either the head housekeeper, or I was the nursemaid for the family, or I was the janitor or the day worker. Those were the roles.
In my opinion, stereotypes are not inherently offensive. It is who uses the stereotype and to what end.
In 1951, the NAACP at its convention condemned Amos and Andy. And in general, people were very surprised at that. How can they condemn Amos and Andy? Amos and Andy had been for years and years and years the #1 program. So reportedly popular in Harlem also. Why were they suddenly complaining of that? So this opened a new discussion about these symbols, these stereotypes.
What in the world is I going to do? This ain't no joke, son. I know. I'll go see my lawyer, Calhoun. Kingfish, the thing for you to do is have your wife, Sapphire, go down to the draft board and plead with him not to take you. Plead with him? That's what I said. Plead with him. Mister, you can't take my husband to the army. You can't do it. He's all I've got in the world. All I've got between me and starvation. And what will become of our 3 little children? Who's going to take care of little Dorothy and Peggy and little Herman? You can't take him, not my man.
Being a fool or being silly gave the whites a chance to justify a certain stereotype. So we in the black community had to hold our artists to a higher standard because they affected how we were treated out in the world.
We had an organization that was sort of fighting the practice of the use that they were making of Negro actors at the time. And this was the case of Amos and Andy. We had particularly objected to the way they described the lawyer. And we asked that this be changed, and they made that change, that he was just a petty politician instead of a lawyer, because this gave the wrong impression of that particular profession of legal representation. I know you compromise on a number of things, but you just don't compromise on certain principles. And so I don't compromise on principles.
Now, Frederick O'Neill, oh my God, he was something else, and has always been. because Fred sacrificed his own career.
There's a man a-going round, taking names. There's a man a-going
I believe I was in a doctor's office when two white men came in. I remember I was lying down and I looked up in their faces, and they said, "Rosetta Lenoir?" I said, "Yes." "Do you live at 2340 7th Avenue?" I said, "Yes." "Let me ask you something." And then one of them sat down and said, "Let me ask you something. Why is it that you attend these red meetings?" He said, "Well, you know that you're on the blacklist. Tell me about Frederick O'Neill. Tell me about Sidney Poitier. Tell me about Brock Peters and whatnot." And I said, "The only thing I can tell you about them is that they're wonderful human beings. They're gentle men, and they're darn good artists. That's what I know about them."
We did the Fred Waring show, and I understand that CBS had more correspondence on that show than any other show at that particular time.
Negro History Week inspires our production of James Weldon Johnson's great poems from God's Trombones.
After we did that, there was a big rush to have it done again. And so Fred got in touch with me, Fred Waring that is, and asked me to come back. When I got back, I was surprised that Fred O'Neill was no longer with the production. And I asked around, and there seemed to be a hush-hush about it. And then I asked Fred Waring, and he said that a young man in the chorus, he would like for him to do it. He had won an audition, and he would like for him to do it. And I said, "Well, you know, I expected to find Fred O'Neill here." And so there were whispers that something about Fred not being, you know, a pinko or something like. But when I would walk in the room, the conversation would talk. So I called Fred O'Neill. I said, "Why aren't you doing it?" He says, "Well, I wasn't asked to do it." I said, "Well, that's strange." And he said, "Well, I think I know why."
He gave as his excuse, as far as I know, that he had been accused of not using blacks in his choir and so forth, and now that he had this one black man in the choir, and that he thought he had better use him, you know, instead. So I learned later that it was McCarthyism that defeated me.
Everybody was so intimidated by the power of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Joe McCarthy, and all those who serviced that evil instrument and that evil moment. It was so overwhelming that people became petrified, they became calcified, they became immobile, they became impotent, they became voiceless. And in the midst of that moment of weakness, many people went to prison, families were torn apart, people's lives were wrecked, professionals and non-professionals were all just cruelly relegated to the dustbin of life and history. And this force began to reign supreme.
McCarthyism is something that we should never forget. The harm that it did to so many innocent people of every race, color, and creed. I know people who jumped off roofs. I know people who took pills, tried to die. Some of them didn't, but they were hurt. A lot of them did die.
This was an awful period. This period of a lot of people committed suicide. Not I won't say a lot of people, but some people committed suicide, and others had just ruined their careers completely.
I made a pledge, a solemn pledge.
Do you want to commit mutiny?
Is it an order?
It's an order.
I can't. The guy's asleep.
Well, that's a break, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's like shooting a sitting duck.
For many of us, Canada Lee was a huge icon. He was one of the very few actors who had invaded Hollywood, that brought a black presence to the screen that was very different from the traditional presence that blacks were forced to portray. He was not a servant. He was not a buffoon. He didn't do anything that was against the dignity of our people. He was a wonderful actor, and the parts that he played were hugely inspiring.
I'll never forget Canada Lee when we opened in Macbeth, the Orson Welles production. It took us months and months and months of hard work, but we enjoyed it because it was so different. And Canada, oh, he was in heaven. And doggone it if it wasn't a smash hit. It is history now.
Canada played with us in Andalusia for a while, you know. He was a very wonderful person to work with. He was a very humorous person, you know, at times, you know.
Canada was committed to struggle. Canada tried to improve conditions.
Will you go alone?
It would be better.
You will find me next door at number 13. There are people of our church there. But their eldest daughter has just run away and is living in Pimville with a young loafer of the streets. Knock there when you're ready.
And when he went to South Africa, came back, he wanted to talk about the situation in South Africa. Well, at that time, I was producing shows for the NAACP at Madison Square Garden. He came backstage and he said, "Dick, let me go on, please. Let me go on. I want to talk about South Africa." Finally, I let him on stage. He started talking about South Africa, and he was discrimination and so forth, and I couldn't get him off. I had to call and say, "Hey, Canada, come off, come off, come off." But he talked about it. He was a great guy, Canada Lee.
Canada ran into the general atmosphere of repression, and I guess it eventually destroyed him.
Canada paid the price of going before the authorities, calling press conferences, trying to declare his name, as did Jackie Robinson, who was a great sports figure, as did Hazel Scott, who was a great musician and a wonderful woman. They went before and tried to play the game on the basis of the rules that had been given them by these various committees and vigilantes, and none of them succeeded.
The gay and the happy and the devilish Canada just absolutely slowly disappeared. He got very quiet, always thinking.
But I do remember the time when he couldn't get a job, and so he decided he'd go out on Broadway with a shoe shine stand and try and get work.
He was very angry about the whole thing, and he once made a statement, "I think I'll get me a shoe shine box and go on 47th Street and Broadway and sit there and wait for white folks to pass by so I can shine their shoes." And that's what Canada Lee said.
At that time, he was pretty well washed up, you know.
And he became very, very disillusioned. And I hate to say this, but I'm sure he died of a broken heart. I'm positive of it.
And when he died, all Harlem turned out for Canada Lee's funeral. I never saw such a big crowd at a funeral in my life.
I know, I'll never forget the funeral. It was the most quiet, sad funeral ever.
Oh, death is the man taking names. Oh, death is the man taking names. He has taken my mother's name and has left my heart in pain. There's a man a-going round, taking names.
I suppose our first efforts to prove to ourselves and to the world that we were more than cattle, that we were more than apes and more than subhuman beings fit only to plow and to to be worked to death as slaves. I suppose the first people who could make a statement that said we too are human were those among us who could sing or dance or some way be entertaining. The artist could go where nobody else could go. And the artist could sometimes speak to the people assembled, the powerful people, and say something about what was happening to the rest of us.
When Jackie Robinson testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, he said something that was taken out of the newsreel. He said, the fact that it is a communist who denounces injustice in the courts, police brutality, and lynching doesn't change the truth of these charges. Just because communists kick up a big fuss over racial discrimination when it suits their purposes, a lot of people pretend that the whole issue is a creation of the communist imagination. And talk about communists stirring up Negroes to protest only makes the present situation worse than ever. Negroes were stirred up long before there was a Communist Party and will stay stirred up long after the party has disappeared, unless Jim Crow has disappeared by then as well. Has it?
I met my brother the other day. I gave him